I'm Jordan Hansen. I've been a professional VFX artist for nearly a decade, and today I'm going to walk you through a shot that every new and aspiring VFX artist should be able to pull off and have on their demo reel. So settle in, this is Mighty North. Screen inserts, burn-ins, comps, no matter what they're called, adding screen content to footage that's already been shot is a common effect for new artists. There are all kinds of reasons that a screen won't be shot at the same time the footage is. A production may want to use a fictional UI on a computer or a phone screen. A television on set may not have had power run to it. Or the graphics the production wants to use may not even exist at the time of the shoot, and it'll be up to the VFX artist to create them. Whatever the reason is, the solution is the same: inserting the screen in post. Having a few of these on your demo reel will show you can pull off one of the more requested VFX shots. I'm going to walk you through this in After Effects, but the principles are the same whether you're working in Nuke or Fusion. The first thing I do in After Effects is make sure my project is set up correctly. Click this 8 bits per channel button here. Come to this drop down and select 16 bits per channel. I don't know of too many productions that finish in 8 bits any longer. If you have an appropriate graphics card, ensure that your Mercury GPU acceleration is set to CUDA on the PC, or if you're working on a Mac, set to Metal. This will speed up your workflow a lot over Mercury software only. Hit OK, and our project is set up and we're ready to begin. Next, I build my folder structure. Click this folder button down here and start typing _comps. Click the comps folder and hit the folder button again, and this time name it _precomps. Next, we make an elements folder, and lastly an oneg folder. That's our source footage, and depending on where you're working, that may be called source or footage or oneg. It's short for original negative, and when it's up to me, I end up just calling it oneg because the first shop I worked at called it oneg, and that's the most intuitive, clearest term to me. Once we're all organized, let's drag in our footage and our screen elements and put them in the appropriate folders. The television footage goes in the oneg folder, and the screen element footage goes in the elements folder. Grab the television footage and drag it down to the Make New Comp button, and it will create a comp that's the same size and duration as the television footage. Drag the comp up to the comps folder, and we'll rename it our TV screen comp 001. In your newly created comp, click on the footage and press enter and name it footage, because to paraphrase Ben Marriott, always label your work. I like to also change the label color to the next color in line so I don't end up with a pile of default colored objects all next to each other. Next, I duplicate the footage and drag it to the bottom. Next, pre-compose the footage by holding Ctrl or Command-Shift-C and checking the box that says Move All Attributes into New Composition, and name this Tracking Comp 001. I always label these tracking comps as dark green or the last color in the list because I've changed the default system colors around. Then I click this eyeball icon to hide the layer. That way, if there's changes to the original footage, we can update that in the tracking comp without losing all of our tracking data. Next, I press Ctrl-Alt-Y to make a new adjustment layer. Select the layer, press Enter and type Color. Then right-click on the layer and make it a guide layer. Expand the Effects and Presets section on the right and search for Lumetri Color. Drag Lumetri onto the color layer and click the arrow next to the words Basic Corrections to expand that section. Increase the contrast and saturation by clicking and dragging on the numbers next to the words, and adjust it until it looks decent. This is just to make sure our effects will hold up under color, not the final look. Since we made the color layer a guide layer, it won't affect the final render. It's just for our use to ensure that the effect holds up no matter how the footage is pushed around after we hand it off to the next stage. Once I have the temp color set up, I click on the words Lumetri Color and hit Ctrl or Command C to copy the effect. Then I double click the tracking comp and select the footage layer and paste the Lumetri Color effect with Ctrl or Command V. That way, when we launch the Mocha interface, the footage will look the same as it does in our final comp. Head back up to the Effects and Presets panel and search for Mocha. Grab Mocha AE and drag it onto the tracking comp. Next, head up to the Effects Controls and click the Mocha button. This will open a new window. This is the Mocha Tracking Interface. Mocha is the planar tracker that's built into After Effects. The first thing I do in Mocha is change the workspace from Essentials to Classic. I've been working with Mocha for a long time and this is how it originally looked, and I'm just most comfortable with the Classic workspace. You can navigate around the workspace by holding X to pan around or hold Z to zoom in and out. To start tracking, first we'll define the area we want to track. Head up to the toolbar at the top and select the pen tool. This will allow us to draw an X-spline on the footage. Left-click to draw a spline around the television we want to track, and then right-click to finalize the spline. We can adjust the tangent weight of each point on the spline individually by pulling out the blue handles. Let's go ahead and pull the handles out so that the spline is just around the edge of the television screen. Then, on the toolbar at the top, click the Show Surface button to enable us to see how Mocha is actually going to solve the track. So then drag the corners of the surface to match the corners of the screen from the footage. Take your time and be precise when doing this. You're defining the edges of the screen for your final comp. Zoom out and take a look at the full surface and ensure you're lined up with the edges of the screen as closely as possible. Come down to the bottom here and make sure translation, scale, rotation, and shear are selected as the type of motion for our track. I normally don't enable perspective tracking on a first attempt because the surface can get too free and really distort the track. Next, come over to the right here and hit the Track 1 Frame Forward button. Make sure the track is following the footage as we expect it to. If everything looks good, hit the Track Forward button to track the rest of the shot. Hit the spacebar or the Stop Tracking button once the surface moves off the screen and check out the results of your track. You can see that it looks like it stuck pretty well throughout most of the shot. It looks like it may have been off a little bit to begin with in this corner, so let's just go ahead and adjust that. The last step is to adjust the track by hand anywhere that it slips, either because of motion blur or lens distortion or whatever. So find the last frame where the track is right on and come down to the bottom left and select the Adjust Track tab. From here, let's work our way forward adjusting the track as we go. Starting with this point, let's zoom in and you can see we get a close-up of where this point is actually landing in this window up in the corner. As we move forward one frame at a time, we can see how far the track drifts. Jump back to the last frame the track point is on screen and adjust it to match the footage. Then do the same thing for the remaining 3 track points. Looks like our adjustment slides off the first frame, so let's bring that point back in. Once you're happy with your track, come up to the top and hit File Save, and then go ahead and close Mocha. I don't apply the results of the Mocha track directly to the footage. I apply it first to a placeholder layer. So come up to the top and select Layer, New, Solid. Click the Make Comp Size button and hit OK. With that done, select the tracking comp again, click the arrow to expand the tracking data section, click Create Tracking Data. It will ask you what layer you want to import the tracking data for. Select whatever you named your tracking layer. In our case, it's layer 2 because I did not label my work. Hit OK. Then change the layer export options to corner pin supports motion blur, and change the layer export to options to the solid we just created. Then click Apply Export. You'll see the solid then jumps into position. Click this button at the top of the timeline window to enable motion blur. Then come down to the bottom of the timeline window and hit the Modes and Switches button if you don't have the motion blur per layer options visible. Then check the motion blur tick box next to the solid layer. Then preview what you've got and check out your track. And if need be, come up to this Options dialog and select Composition Settings. Then click on the Advanced tab and adjust your shutter angle. I shot this so I know the shutter angle is 200 degrees, but if you don't know, experiment a little bit until you find the shutter angle that best matches your footage. For shutter phase, I find that -90 is a good place to start experimenting from. What that's doing is starting the motion blur slightly before the frame our playhead is on. In other words, the motion blur calculation is centered around the frame instead of starting on the frame. These settings will change depending on the camera and how your footage was shot, but it's important to take some time and experiment in order to get the best results. Once that looks good, select the solid layer in the timeline and hit Ctrl or Command-Shift-C to bring up the Pre-Compose dialog. Then change the settings from Move All Attributes into New Composition to Leave All Attributes in our current composition because we want the corner pin data to exist in this main composition. Then change the name of the new composition to Screen Comp. Hit OK and then double-click the comp in the timeline window to open it up. Then drag the screen element to the timeline window. In this case, it's something I made for this demo. Then jump back to the main comp and check the track with moving footage. Now that I know the track is good, it's time to start integrating the screen into the footage better. Right now it looks like the element is pasted on top of the footage instead of actually in the screen. The first thing I like to do is work on integrating the color better. So I come over to the Effects and Presets window and search for Levels. Grab the Levels effect and drag it onto the screen comp below the corner pin effect. Then we need to start working on matching the colors. Click on the channel viewer here and select a single color channel. Starting with the red channel, compare the values of the footage and the element you're putting on the screen. See if the brightest areas of the red channel look right in comparison to each other. See if the darkest areas match each other. The white and black points look pretty good, but we could lift the black point maybe a little bit. So come over to the Levels Effects controls and change the channel to red. Then start dragging this arrow on the lower bar to the right a little bit to increase the output black level. Something like that looks pretty good. Then zoom out to see how the shot looks overall. Then work your way through the other channels. Switch to the green channel in both the viewer and the Levels Effect controls. Bring the white point on the green channel down a little bit. Lift the black point a little bit. Adjust the blue channel until it looks pretty close. Then switch the channel viewer back to RGB and see if anything looks strange. Looks like it's shifted a little towards magenta. So come over to the Levels Effect controls and tweak the output levels until the image looks right. Next we'll address the focus and the depth of field. You can see the footage in this area is a little out of focus, while the screen insert is perfectly sharp. We need to reduce the sharpness of the screen insert element overall. So head up to the Effects and Presets window and search for Gaussian Blur. Drag the Gaussian Blur effect to the bottom of the Screen Comp effects stack. And this is 6K footage, so we have to start increasing that Gaussian blur value quite a lot before we see an effect. Let's start with something around a 7 pixel blur. And that gives us an edge that looks about right along the sharp side of the screen insert. Then we need to work on matching the depth of field of the shot, as this corner is more out of focus than this corner of the TV. So to do that, hit Layer, New, Solid. Make sure it's comp size, hit OK, and let's call it Ramp. Then go up to Effects and Presets and search for Ramp, and drag a gradient ramp onto the ramp solid we just created. Then let's drag the start and the end of the ramp markers to the corners, because it looks like the footage goes this way in depth. So let's turn the ramp back on and move the start and the end of the ramp markers more like this. We're trying to create a fake depth map to drive a blur effect. So then drag the ramp to the bottom of the layer stack in the timeline window, and come up to the Effects and Presets window and search for Camera Lens Blur. Then drag the Camera Lens Blur effect onto the Screen Comp layer. And where it says Blur Map Layer, select the ramp, and change the next drop down to Effects and Masks. Previously, we would have had to pre-compose the ramp with the effect inside, but that's no longer necessary when we switch it to Effects and Masks. Then we hit this button to solo the ramp, and we can see that this area is about where we want the focus to be, and we want the blur effect to get stronger as we move away from this edge of the television. So let's solo the ramp again, and come up here and open up the info panel. Then if we hover our mouse over the viewer, we get a value for each channel in the info panel. In this area, it's around 0.7, and that's the area we want to be in focus. So we go over to the effects controls and change the blur focal distance to 0.7. Then unsolo the ramp layer and increase the blur radius to 15. And now we can see that this edge is about as blurry as the footage in this area. And this edge stayed just about as sharp as it was before we applied the camera lens blur effect. Check the edges all the way around to see that the blur on the element matches the focus on the footage. Let's run a RAM preview and check out the shot in motion. Another thing we can do to further integrate the screen element into the footage is to reduce the opacity. So select the screen comp layer and press T on the keyboard to open the opacity controls and reduce the opacity just a little bit to maybe 90%. Because there is nothing on the screen in the footage, this is just an easy way to further integrate the screen element. This shot is looking pretty good now, but one thing that I notice is that there's no projected light from the TV screen. In reality, the TV would cast a subtle glow over everything that matches the screen element. Luckily, that's pretty easy to pull off. First, duplicate the screen comp layer by clicking it in the timeline window and hitting Ctrl or Command D on the keyboard. Then on the bottom copy, delete the camera lens blur from the effects control window because it's pretty costly to render. And let's label the bottom layer glow and increase the Gaussian blur till we see some light spilling off the edge of the screen. Let's solo the glow layer and we can see how far we have to push the effect up. Something like 100 pixels in our case looks good. And if we look around the edges, especially where it's bright, we can see that the screen is spilling some light onto the TV bezel. And since we made the screen comp layer slightly transparent, the blurry glow layer causes the colors to bloom and bleed into each other like a slightly less than perfect television screen. Now watching that in motion, you can see that the glow matches the screen element and really helps sell that the projected light is coming from the television screen. Finally, the last thing to finish this shot off is to match the grain on the screen element to the grain in the footage. Since we're scaling down and blurring the screen element a lot, we're losing any grain that's in the original plate. The screen element just looks way too clean compared to the footage. So we work basically the same way as we did with the color, one channel at a time. Come down to the channel viewer and select the red channel. Then I select the screen comp layer and the glow layer and hit Command or Control-Shift-C on the keyboard to bring up the pre-composed dialog and call the new comp Grain Comp and hit Enter. Then go over to the Effects and Presets window and search for Add Grain and drag the Add Grain effect onto the Grain pre-comp. In the Effects Controls window, expand the channel intensities and the channel size sections and change the viewing mode from Preview to Final Output. And we can see that the grain is much more sharply defined from the add grain effect than it is in the red channel of the footage here. So the first thing I usually do is increase the softness across all three channels to something like 1.1. And then the size of the grain looks pretty good, but it is way too intense. So let's bring that down somewhat. Come over to the channel intensities in the effects controls window and drop the red channel intensity to about 0.5. And that matches a lot better. Next we move on to the green channel. Green is typically the cleanest channel in video footage. So the add grain effect starts off way too heavy and way too big. So let's drop the green channel size down to 0.7 and the intensity down to 0.2 to start with. That gets us close, but now it's a little too clean, so let's increase the intensity to 0.3. And that's a lot closer. Compare the screen comp grain to the footage grain. And lastly, the blue channel, which is typically the coarsest grain. Look how large that grain is in the footage. We may even need to go above 1 for the grain size, something like 1.2. Now let's look around at the different values and compare the grain. You can see that that's a pretty close match. But let's drop the intensity a little to 0.7. Then let's switch the channel viewer back to RGB, and if we look we can see that the grain matches the footage very closely. Add grain is a slow effect to process, but it allows a great deal of control to get really close to the grain you're trying to match. Let's fit the comp to the viewport and preview that. And there we have the final shot. Our comp is well integrated. It looks like it's actually sitting in the television screen instead of pasted on top. Compare this to the comp before we adjusted the color, the focus, and added the grain back in, and see how much better our final result sits in the footage. If you want to try out this setup, you can grab the footage and the project file from my website, mightynorthmedia.com. The link is below. Let me know what you thought of this video, and I'll be back with more production setups. See you in the next one!